Hello, hello, good afternoon. Welcome back, everybody, to your Kopi Chats with me, Waylene. Today, we have more Ukraine. It's everywhere. You can't look anywhere without talking about that. But, you know, fortunately, we've got a little bit of something different. And I want to start you off on that. Let us begin with this handsome gentleman. This is Mr. Tim Leisner, former head of Goldman Sachs in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, he is now unemployed because he was helping former Prime Minister Najib steal money. Now there's a trial ongoing for Mr. Leisner's then colleague Roger Ng. There's a trial for Roger Ng, and I think Tim Leisner is testifying. See, so I'm surprised that this is not bigger news in Malaysia. Slightly surprised. There's a lot of juicy stuff going on. There were 3 bond issuances in for the 1MDB. So when the company 1MDB, this famous corrupt company was set up, it had to be funded, and so to fund it, to get money, bonds were issued, and a lot of institutions and countries issue bonds, which are just a financial instrument. If you buy the bond, eventually you'll be able to get the money back as well as some returns. And so Goldman Sachs was the bank that was helping to sell these bonds to raise the money, make the bond issue, as they call it. There's always a lot of fancy jargon for finance. Yeah, and Ng has now been charged in New York for under anti-bribery laws and money laundering. Here are some court transcripts from some testimony. Catalyze was the name of the 3rd bond issuance, so it was called Project Catalyze. License said to Joe Low said to Roger and Leisner that there was an election in Malaysia coming and that all monies from Project Catalyze need to be utilized for that election, for election purposes. Amazing. They would just say it out loud. We have to use this for the elections, even though you can't do that, right? Because the money raised is meant to be for 1MDB to invest for the good of the country. But they all knew it. They all knew what was going on. Leisner said he was made to understand it was common practice to give out handouts to voters. I can only speak for myself. I've never received any handouts for votes. I would have loved to, but I never got any. I guess I didn't live in a place where my vote was important. That's just too bad. Let's see. He added he does not know where exactly the money from Project Catalyze was going, and he did not know whether then Prime Minister Najib was going to receive anything personally from it. On the same day, Tim Leisner also testified that he and Ng each received $17.5 million in kickbacks for the involvement in the first bond issuance that raised $1.75 billion. Wow. And he said he also received kickbacks for the second bond issuance without saying how much he received. Also, equally, we had gotten at Goldman Sachs excessive fees that weren't normal for transactions of this kind. It's just totally awful. So in an earlier video, I had spoken about this issue, and Tim Leisner already said that red flags were raised, questions were asked about the project 1MDB. There were already suspicions that it wasn't in the clear, that it was perhaps somewhat shady, but it went ahead nonetheless. He got paid the kickbacks. The fees quoted were way higher than normal. Definitely enough to raise plenty of questions all around, but it never happened. It gives me I already did not really trust large banks, but this just cements it totally. Leisner also went on. There's another piece that just reports that Najib's personal secretaries were involved in the 3rd 1MDB bond issuance. So just testifying that it went very close to Mr. Najib. Here, the first bond was called Project Magnolia, while second was Project Maximus, third one was Project Catalyze. Due to the need for a letter of support, Leisner had several meetings with the Finance Ministry and Treasury, and also Najib's Principal Private Secretary, Azlin Alias, as well as Amhari Effendi Nazaruddin. Let's see. So there's a lot of money flowing around, a lot of shadiness, meeting all the top level people, and I've seen no reason to doubt the testimony of Mr. Leisner. Already, PM Najib has been convicted. I mean, he has an appeal pending, ongoing, and that's a legal process. It'll work itself out. But I think people are just simply tired by now, even though there are these allegations that add a lot more meat to the case, to going on, to what went on exactly. Seems that there's not really a lot of interest. I don't see it reported, widely elsewhere. I don't think that people are really angry about it. So I think Malaysians are just rather done with it, rather just move on with our lives. But it is juicy if you're interested in this sort of thing. And as usual, I'll put the links in the show notes. Check it out if you're interested. I'll move on to the next thing. I saw this editorial by a professor of political science at the National University of Singapore, Dr. Elvin Ong. And I spent a fair amount of time thinking about it because, it's a very timely piece, coming as it does, with the conflict in Ukraine, Russia's invasion. So it's really interesting as well because, I like to understand all kinds of things for the fun of it. And he was making the case that Singaporeans need to understand war rhetoric. Now, what exactly does he mean? Why does he say that? Well, let's jump into it. So I'll try to skim as quickly as I can. I made some notes here. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a sobering reminder. It's a harsh reality of international politics. Yes, definitely. Can't agree more. As a small nation, we can never take our territorial integrity and sovereignty for granted. I totally agree. We must always be prepared to defend ourselves without relying on the help of others. Certainly. You want to strengthen your, sovereignty and your, defense capabilities as much as possible. Beyond this, there are also lessons about the rhetoric of war that foreign adversaries may use, which Singaporeans need to be aware of. Now, I think this is entirely timely because, as I mentioned, I think in my last video, fake news. There's studies that there's one big study that showed that fake news is a huge issue, and that many people are susceptible to it. So this is exactly, I can't agree more with Dr. Ong here. Now, let's move on here. If a country's target population and army do not recognize and not inoculated against rhetoric and propaganda, they will fall easily into the trap laid by the aggressor government. Entirely possible, right? So this is really important, and I think the repeated surfacing of this theme in Singapore news is really a reflection of how important it is. Okay. Now here he goes on to discuss to break down learning from Russia's rhetoric justifying war in Ukraine. He tries to lay out Russia's case as well as make some arguments, about why it isn't, valid. Well, how to think about it rather. So let's look at it. I took some notes here. First, Russia claims to justify war in Ukraine because Ukraine was historically part of Russia. It sounds a bit simplistic, but let's try to take it as it is and move on. Since Ukrainians and Russians are essentially one people, Russia is justified in invading Ukraine to unite the two territories. But why should historical roots of peoples be justification for contemporary war? It is simply absurd, he says, to suggest that just because countries share some unique historical cultural identity, therefore armies can roll over borders and launch missiles. Right. So just because historically two places have been very close or even part of the same country, made a part of an empire a long time ago, you can't. Today it may be entirely different, right? And I think you would generally agree in that. Now let me take this thought a little bit further, right? Because I think Dr. Ong would agree if I say that war is not the way to unite countries that have been separated. For instance, Ireland has been separated into the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland under the rule of the UK, or you might say, England, and they've been fighting for a long time, and clearly it has not resolved their issues. They have not. There's been no resolution, right? And the same could be said of Korea. The peninsula of Korean peninsula is split into two countries, and I don't think anybody in the world wants to see war to reunite the two Koreas. Perhaps one day in the future they will reunite, but nobody wants to see any reunification by war. Now it's the difficult part. Would we say the same about Taiwan? If we take the position that just because two places have close historical ties, they doesn't mean that they ought to be or should be combined into one entity. Do we apply that same principle to Taiwan? Would Dr. Ong advocate propose that Singapore as a country, as a political entity on the global stage, support Taiwanese independence as a consequence? No, I don't think so, right? I don't think Singapore does that at all. That's absurd. Why? Because, well, you have to deal with the reality in the world that is China would be very angry and there would be consequences for that. So, yes, I agree that the argument that two places that have a lot of things in common, we cannot accept the argument they should be combined just because of commonality. So that's true. I would agree with that. But I don't think it's also something that we can accept unquestioningly, right? Because we do not live in a world where principle trumps everything. We live in a world where there are such things as, the one might say, reality on the ground. Like, for instance, in Israel, right? You might say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a place where there's a reality on the ground. Israel occupies this much territory, and there's no chance. Well, as a commentator on the internet, it looks to me like there's no chance that Israel will just give up that land back to the Palestinian authorities. So, while we may say, we don't like it, we operate within the constraints of what is present in the real world. Okay, so far so good, right? So far so good. I think we have a lot more agreement than disagreement so far. Now let's see. The next part. Let's see. Secondly, Russia claims to justify war in Ukraine because Russian peoples in eastern Ukraine were marginalized and suppressed. They had declared independence from Ukraine and had asked Russia for help. Yet domestic unrest among populations ever present within nation states today, countries can be open to legitimate criticism by external parties about the unrest, but waging war against them is simply preposterous. Okay. So first of all, take note that Dr. Ong, he notes that the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, had declared independence, but he doesn't refer to them as such. He would call it domestic unrest, whereas the people in Donetsk and Luhansk would say, no, it's not unrest. We've declared independence. We're free of that. We're not. Don't call it domestic, unrest in Ukraine, because we're not part of Ukraine anymore. We don't want to be part of it. So, does that mean we should not recognize, the DPR and LPR, which is the Donetsk, People's Republic, and the Luhansk People's Republic? I would say that seems to go against the founding spirit of Singapore, right? Because, okay, I say this carefully, but, it's a bit of history. It's not something happening today. I don't think I'll get in trouble for it. Where at the time that Singapore broke apart from Malaysia, would it have been better for the Federation of Malaya, which no longer exists, by the way? Now Malaysia exists, but back then the Federation of Malaya, would it have been better for the Oh no, never mind. So would it have been better for the Federation to crush domestic unrest in the state of Singapore? Back then it's still a state in Malaysia, and say like, okay, we will not, we'll accept that domestic unrest among a population is ever present. and we cannot just allow a country to declare their independence because we will not recognize it. That seems to be the implication here. No, I don't think so. I don't think we'd agree with that, right? Uh, if a country, if a territory decides that I'm independent, and also Malaysia, which I used to be a part of, accepts that I'm independent, so you should also accept that I'm independent. So if the DPR and LPR, they declare that they're independent, they show that they're independent, if they can get Russia's recognition, if they can get a lot of people's recognition for that, are we still to say that no, this is just some domestic unrest? I think that would be rather silly, right? So I don't think that this is a very solid rebuttal, because this again has to take into account, well, how many, maybe we have to take into account how many countries recognize the claim from the DPR and LPR of their independence, right? And if they recognize, if they are well recognized, perhaps their plea for help should be supported, right? Because we would recognize them as independent nations. It seems silly to say that, oh, well, if there is a domestic unrest, we're always just going to call it domestic unrest, and we will not, recognize if the entity breaks apart, because we do in fact do that. There was a country called Yugoslavia. It broke up. Yugoslavia broke up into, Albania, Serbia, and so on. So we do in fact see domestic unrest result in the breakup of countries, and we do in fact recognize those countries, right? Now, Dr. Ong, okay, he makes it clear that these are issues up to the population and democratically elected government of the day to resolve, and hardly be any reasonable pretext for invasion. You might say that, but this has in fact happened in the past. So I can recall this example I gave also in the previous video, that Kosovo, what used to be a part of Serbia, and Serbia, independent country formed from the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, but Kosovo had its own problems. They wanted to break away, and they asked for help from the United States and NATO, and guess what? They agreed. So NATO sent in their fighter jets to conduct a bombing campaign to push back the Serbian army successfully, I might add. So is that acceptable, or is that not acceptable? If it's not acceptable, should we be criticizing it? Is it something that we reject? Because it has happened and probably will happen again in the future, and there's never been I don't recall seeing any editorials or news reports rejecting, decrying this invasion into Serbia, interference in Serbian local affairs. So sounds rather like this is a principle that is impossible to hold, is what I would say. Okay, thirdly, Russia claims to justify war in Ukraine because Ukraine's bid to join NATO threatened Russia's security. Hence, Russia was justified in invading Ukraine because it was protecting itself. Yet, it is not justified to wage war just because one country disagrees with another's foreign policy. A cornerstone, he says that countries should always have the autonomy to choose their own foreign policy. And I find that is certainly very, very true, right? Like there's no reasonable person would dispute that. In fact, if it seems like so true that there's really nothing to say about that, right? Now, in fact, I think that might be a little bit of an oversimplification. So let me explain what I mean. So if frame this in this way, yes, it sounds that like absurdly true, like so true that there's nothing you can say about it. Of course, countries should always have the autonomy to choose their own foreign policy. Correct. But again, I don't think that takes into account the reality of the world, which is that if you lived next to military power, you have to take into account their positions and their considerations, right? For instance, in 1962, there was something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. You may have heard of this before, but you may not know the details. I looked it up, interestingly enough. So what happened at the time was that the Soviet Union wanted to put nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, independent island, island nation of Cuba. Now, the United States, hearing of this plan, decided to block this. So they sent their warships, to surround Cuba and prevent Soviet vessels from delivering the nukes. Now, was the US interfering in another country's foreign policy? Yes. And would Dr. Ong approve of that? I don't know. And is it, can we strictly adhere to the principles that Dr. Ong is laying out? Like, countries should have the autonomy to choose their own foreign policy. You can't just, like, the traditional, let's say, historical unity of one territory is not justification for war. Yeah, agree. But Taiwan. And then domestic unrest, cannot be a justification for invasion. Yes, agree. Also, what if the unrest, the domestic unrest, the people involved don't see themselves as domestic anymore? They don't see themselves as part of that country. Well, then what? So it all seems to me like Dr. Ong is introducing concepts that seem very concrete right until the moment that they come in touch with reality, and then it's just totally, it's like taking a pure drop of paint and then dropping it into a pool of water. The drop of paint looks so clear, so beautiful, so blue, or so red, whatever color you think it is, until it comes in contact with the pool of water, and suddenly, woof, it's all gone. Like, it's all diffused and nothing is clear anymore. Everything is a mess. And that's kind of what it feels like here. So the United States did interfere in Cuba's foreign policy, did interfere in the Soviet Union's foreign policy. Is it a bad thing? I don't know. Should we support it? Also, I don't know. Dr. Ong goes on to say, so long as the country's leaders are democratically elected and accountable, a country's foreign policy should not be subject to the dictates of larger powers. Yeah, it shouldn't be. Yet it is. It just is, because that is the world we live in. I don't think that we live in a world where we can talk about these matters, like in a simple way. Okay, going back to Taiwan. Do we support Taiwan declaring independence because each country should be free to conduct their diplomacy? No, of course not. Diplomacy doesn't take place in a vacuum. Like human relations, one country's decision often impacts her neighbors. So it has to be understood, I think, in that context. It feels rather one-dimensional, to talk about it like these are the principles and everybody should just follow them. Now, Dr. Ong goes on to say, Singapore must always conduct its foreign policy based on calculations of its own domestic interests, free from the lurking shadows of others. Yes, well, I agree that with the first part, Singapore must always conduct its foreign policy based on the calculation of its own domestic interests. But I disagree with the second part. It should be weighing Singapore's domestic interests involves considering the lurking shadows of others. You have to consider those shadows when weighing your own interests. How would you know your interests otherwise? And here's the part that strikes me as the most, and this is the part that I say this carefully. It seems naive. War is completely unnecessary to exert international influence. Seems really naive. And I don't understand how this can be written by somebody who whose job is to study political science. So I can just answer that with the question: would Imperial Japan have given up the East Asian Greater Co-Prosperity Sphere? Would Japan have given up all her possessions in Asia, if not for defeat in World War II? I doubt it. Right? It's not completely unnecessary. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary. But enough about that. Moving on to the next part. Here's something we can totally agree on: strengthening critical reading and thinking. I hope, Dr. Ong, you appreciate at least that I am making an effort to approach your arguments with critical thinking, right? Not just to accept what is presented to me verbatim, but to read it, evaluate it, compare it to what I know, and then make a decision. And maybe one further discussion point from this would be starting from somewhere here. Okay, a gullible citizenry highly exposed to the rhetoric and propaganda of foreign political elites and foreign media as a liability to Singapore's psychological defense. Absolutely, I agree. So we have to learn to be more critical, have a healthy, moderate skepticism. Yes. So how do we evaluate the claims, of media, particularly foreign media? Now, this is a serious question, because this is what I want to show you in relation to that. Here's a professor formerly from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Huang Jing. Professor Huang Jing. Professor Huang was banned from Singapore and had his permanent residency cancelled for being an agent of influence for a foreign country. Professor Huang engaged prominent Singaporeans, gave them what he said was privileged information to influence their opinions in favor of that country. He gave privileged information to Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy senior members, who conveyed this to very senior public officials in position to direct Singapore's foreign policy. There you are, that's Professor Huang. And they are US citizens. Yes. I like that the news report emphasized they're US citizens, okay? And we didn't say what country they're, advocating on behalf of, okay? They are United States citizens. Now, but we are going to kick them out for being an agent of influence of a foreign country, who work with the intelligence organizations and agents from that country. The country shall remain unnamed. But you wouldn't be surprised if you learned that Dr. Huang was director of the Center of Asia and Globalization and Lee Foundation professor on U.S.-China relations. His views on China and foreign policy issues were regularly sought by organizations and the media. So I wonder what was the country that Dr. Huang was advocating on behalf of. Don't call me racist, because I am definitely not racist. Okay. Now, he's not the only one. Look here. Double life, two wives. Duke and US researcher spied on US for Russia. So I'm not just picking on China, okay? Let's see. Hector Alejandro Cabrera Fuentes, prolific author, prolific scientist, and is guilty of spying on the US on behalf of the Russian government. And he is employed at the National Heart Center of Singapore. So, what is has he been charged for any crime? Let's see. Right, they have been arrested. He will be expected to be sentenced on May 17. May be jailed up to 10 years for the offense. So, it's not as if Singapore has no contact, with issues of spying and foreign influence. And maybe that's why Dr. Ong's article has extra urgency. You can see here, Dr. Ong. So Dr. Ong may even have known Huang Jing personally, or even there was that other guy, Dixon Yo, who also was arrested for spying. He's Singaporean. He spied on the United States on behalf of China. So this is something that happens a lot. If the really smart, highly educated, top people, we might say, in their social standing is very high. If they are being turned by foreign governments all over the place, and these are only the ones we know about, would it not be reasonable to say that Dr. Ong is very serious here, and this is a very serious issue that is people should be more wary, more aware of foreign influence that may not be good for Singapore or whatever country you're from. I mean, I use Singapore as an example, and I live in Singapore, but this would equally apply to you wherever you live. And in fact, let me show you my last example here about Malaysia. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Anifah Aman has issued a sobering warning that if Malaysia does not check regular encroachment into its territorial waters, it could one day find itself in the same boat as Ukraine, which is facing a Russian invasion. The government should take a firmer stance in urging all parties involved in the Ukraine to stop their aggression and commit themselves to peace negotiations. Now, how does this relate to Malaysia? Well, there are geopolitical issues surrounding our Malaysian waters with trespass after trespass by a big supernation to the east. I wonder which country. No, I don't wonder which country. I've already said it before. It's China. The foreign ministry summoned Chinese ambassador Ouyang Yujing, I think, to protest against the presence and activities of Chinese vessels in Malaysian waters. Let's see. Does it mention how many times this happened? No, it doesn't. But I recall it is nearly 100 times, like over 80 times in a past 5 or 6 years, I believe. So Mr. Aman is totally correct, former foreign minister. And it's not just, how do you say this? What is the word again? Infiltration, right? It's not just infiltration of our societies that is a risk. It's also incursion into our very territories. So yeah, it's extremely serious. Okay, I'm done with that topic though. I want to tell you now about the topic of the day: Ukraine. Look at this. President Zelensky demands immediate EU membership for Ukraine. Immediate. And reported in the Straits Times, Ukrainian President Zelensky urged the EU to grant his country immediate membership. Our goal is to be together with all Europeans, and most importantly, to be on equal footing. I'm sure it's fair. I'm sure it's possible. Let's see. He thanked the West for its support. Yes. Okay. That's it. So, President Zelensky demands immediate EU membership for Ukraine. Is that why does he suddenly issue a demand for EU membership? Let's think about that for a moment. Isn't that interesting? That in the middle of a war, he takes the time out of his busy schedule, dodging bullets and shells, to tell the EU that I like to be a member, like immediately. Why would he say that? I have a little idea. It just so happens that there have been talks between Russia and Ukraine about how to stop the conflict. It took place in Belarus. I think it's been 48 hours since the talks began. There's not been much reporting on it. But let's see, when was this? This was in February 28th, so that's many days ago. So why did he say it then? It could be, that President Zelensky wants the Ukraine admitted to the EU immediately for access to the EU common market. I don't know. It doesn't make much sense, right? In the midst of a war to say like, I want to be part of the EU. I want to use the euro. I want to have free movement of capital and labor and access to the EU common market. No, that makes no sense. But it could be a bargaining chip, right? Because when you sit down with Russia to negotiate, You talk about what each party has to give. This feels like a really smart move because you know what it does? It creates an asset. If Russia doesn't want Ukraine to get closer to the EU, well, you can say, okay, this is something I'm willing to give up. I know that you're very sensitive about, Ukraine getting closer to the EU, getting closer to the West, so to speak, in quotation marks. So this is something that he can cook up out of nothing, because the whole world is listening to him. The EU is in a place where they're in a time and place where they're much more likely to give airtime to the views of President Zelensky, and with huge public support for anything that Ukraine wants. Right now, anything that Ukraine wants, the world wants to give it to them. So if President Zelensky comes out and says, I want EU membership and I demand it and it should be fast-tracked, what is the world going to say? Oh, of course, we'll look into it. We'll get started right away, because that's just the way the world is currently. So it's really smart. Really smart. If you think that, if you thought that this is a random flailing of a person, who doesn't know what he's doing, who's just trying to grasp at straws in desperation, no. I'll tell you, please reconsider. Absolutely not. President Zelensky has been very intelligent, I think, with his words, with his decision making, and I would say that this is a calculated move. I'll ask for EU membership. Some processes will begin. It won't be a super strong bargaining chip, but it's something, right? If I can get, a couple of minor extra points from Russia in some concessions in exchange for this, giving up this demand, great, So this is exactly that. Now, bear in mind, though, this is unlikely to happen anytime soon. And let me tell you why. In 2003, the EU held the Thessaloniki, I believe that's how you pronounce it, Thessaloniki Summit, at which it promised Western Balkan countries, including Bosnia, European integration if they met certain admission criteria. In 2016, 13 years later, Bosnia finally applied for EU membership. And 3 years later, Brussels outlined 14 requirements the country has to fulfill in order for the accession procedure to be launched. So it only took, 2003 until now, 19 years for Bosnia to still not be in the EU. So while President Zelensky may, use this as a bargaining chip, and perhaps, with the situation being what it is, there might be some expedited action. There's no way that Ukraine will be in the EU before the conclusion of this war. So that's just to give some context, so what's the likelihood of it happening? What's the timeline that we're looking at? I mean, it could very well change, of course. It could be very fast, but I don't know if it'll be like, compressing 19 years worth of work into 1 month kind of fast. I don't know if it'll be that fast. Okay, moving on. Here's another interesting commentary on Nikkei Asia. Xi misreads Putin's Ukraine gambit despite access to US intel. I read this. I must say I disagree. I'll just be honest and plain that I disagree. But I think we should look into it, and so I can elaborate what it is that I disagree with. It says here that Xi misreads Putin's Ukraine gambit, right? Okay. Tacit support for Russia could damage Beijing's global ambitions. Oh, okay, we'll see. We'll see about that. The war in Ukraine is entering a crucial stage as Russian forces surround Kiev. China, which has strengthened ties with Russia and boasted about their quasi-alliance, will not escape fallout from the war. What fallout, right? What is the fallout? Eventually, Xi Jinping will suffer from his decision to align closely with Vladimir Putin. How? Okay, I'm waiting to be told how. Since Russian troops began massing on the Ukraine border, Chinese leaders continued to misinterpret Putin's intentions and had likely concluded that Russia would not stage an all-out war. Now, the two claims here. How do we know that Chinese leaders misinterpreted Putin's intentions? And how do we know what they concluded? Okay, so two parts. Blah, blah, blah. These are not really important. Xi likely would not have reinforced ties with Russia to such a degree had he known that Russia would invade Ukraine 3 weeks later and be vilified worldwide. Why not? Why not? Why? I simply do not see why not. Russia shows up at the Winter Olympics. Putin shows up at the Winter Olympics. Putin asks for support, saying, I will definitely get sanctioned. I may need to. Now, I predict that I'll be sanctioned in the near future, and I need your help to maybe, to access a financial system. Maybe not the global financial, like Chinese financial system. And also, I need to buy some, materials from you because I won't be able to buy it from Europe. Now, President Xi doesn't have to be told that there's a war breaking out. To him, he could just say, I just want to sell Chinese goods, and I want to buy Russian raw materials. And he can make the conclusion, he can draw his own conclusion that no, there's a high chance that this will be the start of a war. But all Putin wants is to mitigate the fallout, mitigate the problems that are caused by an invasion. So why would there be a problem? And why would President Xi have known? He may not have known. He may not have known. Many China watchers note that Xi failed to recognize the risk from Russia's move until it was too late. Well, what is the risk? So, you see, in addition to reading Xi Jinping's mind, because who knows whether what Xi Jinping actually saw, do you think that he won't notice? Like if Russia shows up for the Winter Olympics and is extra friendly, asked to meet Xi Jinping and also to discuss trade, especially for access to financial system, buying raw materials, asking would you like to buy Russian gas because I think I'll be able to sell you some Russian gas. Does Putin need to spell it out? Does he need to say this is what my calendar says I'm up to in the next month or two, just so you know what I'm up to? No, of course not. So where is this coming from? It makes absolutely no sense. There are reasons to believe China misinterpreted Putin's intent. Finally, right? Finally, we're getting there. Over the preceding 3 months, the U.S. contacted China 6 times and shared classified information about Russia's preparations. The U.S. took this unusual step, hoping that China might be able to persuade Russia to invade. So, the article is persuading us that the U.S. contacted China 6 times and shared classified information about Russia's preparations. And after that, that's a reason to believe China misinterpreted Putin's intent. By giving China accurate, correct information about Russia's preparations, led to China's misinterpretation. That is exactly the opposite. It says here, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken shared intelligence with Chinese Foreign Minister, but China did not take the intel seriously. How do we know that? Possibly believing Russia would not dare to mount such a massive attack. How do we know that? How? Absolutely no way. Blah, blah, blah. Another reason could be that Xi consolidated power to such an extent that his lackeys feared being the bearer of bad news. Aides to Xi are reluctant to bring information analysis contrary to his policy. Right. You know what? This does not require a professional international relations analyst to conclude. If you talk to anybody who's ever worked in any company, they will tell you nobody likes to bring bad news to the boss, especially if the boss is known as a badass. Somebody's very strict, very demanding, and very ruthless. I could have told you that. I could have told you that for free, by the way. I'm doing exactly that right now on YouTube. You're welcome. Beijing's comments on the Russian invasion also lack consistency, reflecting its misreading of Putin. Okay. How so? Please explain. Foreign Minister Wang had previously said the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of any country should be respected and safeguarded. Okay. That's all right. So how is that lacking consistency? Oh, when the invasion started, China changed its stance, defended Russia's position. Another spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry refused to admit that Russia had undertaken an invasion. So that is held up as proof that China changed its stance from saying the sovereignty of Ukraine should be respected. And after that, China refused to call what Russia had done an invasion. And so the author is saying that this is a lack of consistency. I don't see it. I don't see it. Do you? So there is a principle that, yes, sovereignty of any country should be respected and safeguarded. Ukraine is no exception. Sounds like a very normal thing to say. And then Russia has undertaken, some military action. If I don't use the word invasion, does it automatically mean that I'm defending Russia's position? No. It sounds to me like I'm being neutral, which sounds pretty damn neutral to me. And you know how neutral this is? You know how neutral this is actually in reality? It's so neutral. It's so neutral that the Ukraine foreign minister has asked China to mediate a ceasefire. That's how neutral it is. It's so neutral that even though Vladimir Putin visited Beijing for the Winter Olympics, Ukraine's foreign minister asked China to mediate a ceasefire. That's how neutral it is. So, is it some kind of lack of consistency? Is it in truth Xi misreading Putin's Ukraine gambit and losing face, facing pressure, damaging global ambitions? No, it looks like China's winning. China has got so much respect that Ukraine wants China to mediate the ceasefire. Now, granted, I'll grant you that there is a little confusion within China here. Look at this. Chinese news outlet accidentally posts censorship instructions on Russia-Ukraine coverage. Now, Chinese news regularly censors itself. Let's see. Some internal guidelines, that says comments and reports deemed unfavorable to Russia cannot be published. Right. So China's government wants its media to be neutral. Don't be critical of Russia. At the same time, here, the Canadian embassy in Beijing is permitted to put up a flag supporting Ukraine. Okay, sorry, I thought this was like the Chinese embassy in Canada. It was actually the Canadian embassy in Beijing. Embassies are allowed to do what they want, so it's not really a big deal. But China is muting criticism. I think that's the important part here is that censors are muting criticism of Russia. And Ukraine respect China so much, they invite China to mediate negotiations, the ceasefire, not the United States. So does this seem credible? Does it seem credible that the support for the Russian invasion is damaging Beijing's global ambitions? Doesn't seem credible to me. Does it seem credible that Beijing's comments on Russian invasion lack consistency, causing problems for China? I don't think so. Within the administration of Joe Biden, there's disappointment with China and growing backlash. Does China care that Joe Biden is disappointed? Does China care? I don't think so. I think that's the last thing Xi Jinping cares about. So, all in all, I'm afraid this is not a very strong editorial. Not a very strong editorial. And I hope I made my case clearly, right? Now, moving on. There are some, follow-on consequences, and you can see these consequences start to ripple out through the world. That is, from Manila to Tokyo, defense debate is starting to heat up amid the Ukraine crisis. Ukraine war, even. See here in Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila. Let's see. South Korea needs a nuclear sharing agreement with the U.S., said presidential hopeful An Chol-soo. South Korea is having their presidential elections really soon, and so that's why there's a televised debate about foreign policy. And one of the candidates has advocated a nuclear sharing agreement with the U.S. Now, I'm not exactly sure what this means, but I think it means that they will share nuclear weapons. So South Korea would be hosting nuclear weapons on their soil to protect themselves, right? Sharing the U.S.'s nuclear weapons. Not necessarily to store American nuclear weapons on South Korean bases, but to share America's tactical nuclear weapons Okinawa and Guam in case of emergency, right? So might be to place weapons on South Korean bases, but might also be to share those weapons that already exist. I guess they would contribute, monetarily, financially to the maintenance of those weapons. The US does not have nuclear weapons on either of the island, but An envisions a scenario where strategic launchers there could be loaded quickly with bombs. He questioned the effectiveness of America's current extended deterrence, launching nuclear weapons from a submarine or from the US mainland, saying that, okay, I guess he means that it should be closer by, not kept so close to the US mainland, but projected further away. And I understand that, and I think it's a reflection of the importance, and the anxiety that some South Korean leaders are feeling about the security situation of Korea right now, right? 2 days later, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe touched on the notion of nuclear sharing during a TV appearance. In NATO, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy take part in nuclear sharing, hosting American nuclear weapons. He called for the US to abandon its long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan and make it clear that it will come to the island's defense. So that was Shinzo Abe, former Prime Minister. But current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida quickly shut down the nuclear sharing proposal, saying it goes against Japan's principles. Okay. So Korea and Japan are increasingly concerned about security, and now that has extended as well to the Philippines, who is also having presidential elections. So during a debate, 6 of the 9 presidential candidates said the country needed to take a clear stand in support of Ukraine, rejecting the defense secretary's suggestion of staying neutral. We have nothing to do with Europe or whatever they are doing, the defense chief had said. And let's see, at the debate, one of the candidates praised President Zelensky of Ukraine, saying he's ready to die for his country. That's a true leader. So 6 of 9, that's pretty interesting, right? 6 of 9 of the candidates are in support, in favor of supporting Ukraine. And context for this is, let's see, the Philippines last year filed multiple diplomatic protests over China's ship's presence in Manila's exclusive economic zone. That's out in the sea, right? There's certain, I think something like 8 miles worth of sea from the land is considered the country's exclusive economic zone. Only you can use that sea. So the Chinese Navy sailed out to those waters and took over a place called Scarborough Shoal. So the Philippines also very concerned about the Chinese Navy. So what does this tell us exactly? Now I think that it's obviously super clear that Korea, Japan, Manila, and as I showed you earlier, Malaysia are very concerned about the security situation. They're concerned about the Chinese Navy in their waters, and some of them are concerned about what might happen, if there was military action on Taiwan. So this is all very predictable, shall we say, all very predictable, all heating up because of what's going on in the world. People are worried about what will happen in regards to Taiwan, in regards to their territorial waters, because China lays claim to most of the South China Sea. Now, I think that, now this is my personal opinion, I think that the right move here for the countries involved is to support Ukraine. Now, allow me to explain this. It might be, okay? It's my opinion. It's just my opinion. And I'm not a professional. So what might be happening is that China is observing what happens with the crisis. If Russia takes over Ukraine, with minimal pain, they suffer whatever losses they have to suffer. Then after that, they take over. They try to resume normal business activity. And if most of the world allows Russia to get back to normal, then China will look at that and decide, okay, so that's the price I have to pay. While I am, waging my war, there will be these sanctions, there will be these things that happen, and after that, maybe things will be able to go back to normal. So that's what they're observing. They're definitely paying attention to the situation, right? Because there are people whose whole job is to do that, exactly that. Now, if as many countries in the world make it as painful as possible for Russia to do what they're doing without sending, actual troops there, we make it as painful as possible, what does that happen? What does that teach China? It teaches them that they shouldn't do this. The price is very high, right? So by punishing Russia, by assisting Ukraine, this is also this not only helps Ukraine, it's also a signal to China about what could happen, will happen, if there is action on Taiwan. So should these countries, all of these countries involved, support Ukraine as loudly as they can? Yeah, probably. And to her credit, Singapore has actually imposed sanctions on Russia. Now, Singapore is small, granted, but Singapore is not standing by. So I would, if anybody is watching and you want to tell your leaders about this, please let them know. I think you should factor into their calculations, right? Tweet to them, tell them on Facebook. Okay, moving on. There's a little bit more about the Ukraine invasion and the consequences. So here's a piece saying, will China's yuan payment system offer a lifeline? I think this short answer is yes. Yes, it will. And now it's, becoming increasingly clear that China would benefit. China would benefit because their system would come into use, more wider usage. Their cross-border interbank payment system will be more important for trade settlement between China and Russia, which is great because Chinese banks will do more business, right? Process more money, more widely accepted. And also, let's see, there's another piece saying Chinese tech firms face this dilemma over Western sanctions on Russia. So this piece was saying that will China's yuan payments offer a lifeline, or will it be beneficial? The answer is yes. Chinese tech firms face dilemma over Western sanctions on Russia. No, there's no dilemma. There's no dilemma. Complying with Western sanctions, Russia would run counter the Chinese government's official policy of opposing such measures. Yes, it would. However, Chinese companies could find themselves subject to huge fines and penalties for breach of sanctions if they work with targeted entities. To clarify, this means that if they work with targeted entities in Russia, then European or American authorities could punish those Chinese banks and companies. So, is there a dilemma? No, there is no dilemma, my friends. Why? It's simply that China has more options now. Look, so if Chinese companies want to do business with the United States or Europe and they're able to do so, they will do so. Why? Because they can. They will make that money so long as they're able to. And if they are making good money there, well, then don't risk that good thing by doing business with Russia. So they will not do business with Russia. Why is that so hard? And if some Chinese companies are not doing business with the US or Europe, well, suddenly Russia is very keen to do business with them because maybe Russia's usual suppliers are not able to step up because, there are sanctions. So some Chinese companies will benefit and some Chinese companies will not. Some will so it won't be an evenly distributed benefit, but somebody's got to do that Russia business. So you can see that the media asks these questions and it's very interesting, but I think generally it's an unqualified good. Like, it's all good. It's all good for China as far as this goes. All right. That's all I have to say about the China and Russia, the implications. I think it's pretty straightforward. It's all good for China. They're gaining prestige and gaining resources, while the countries that are most worried about security are freaking out. So it's kind of I would be a little bit nervous if I was in the government. I would be a little bit nervous. Yeah. Moving on now. It's the last thing. So check this out. Indonesian Chinese are reviving their original family surnames, getting inspiration from Javanese customs, American culture, and Islam. Name giving in Indonesia has a colorful history for most of its 1,300 ethnic groups. So the Chinese, it was troubling when they had to abandon their names. Today, Western Islamic and K-pop influences are, shaping people's name giving habits. All right. So in 1955, China signed a treaty with Indonesia to resolve dual nationality. So Chinese people in Indonesia had to choose whether to be Indonesian or Chinese. Okay, and then in 1967, in an attempt at assimilation, Indonesian government issued a decree compelling all Indonesian Chinese ancestry to abandon the Chinese names in favor of Indonesian ones. And which is now it seems to be loosened, and so people are now gravitating towards traditionally Chinese names, original family surnames. And there's some it's very simple, not a very complicated topic. Look here, Surabaya born Hueli Ongkowijoyo has named his newborn daughter Vivian Wang. So now people are free once again to name their kids whatever they want, and that hasn't been all good. Hasn't been all good. In 2000 was the year that the ban was lifted, but it's taken until now, 2022, when this has become like very widespread. In 2013, it was when father of Vivian Wang, what was it? Hueli Ongkowijoyo, decided to pick up the courage and revert to Wang. So, giving people I can see why there might be some desire to control people's names, because check this out. There are some names which definitely you don't want to see. There was a baby boy in March 2022 named Virus Abdul COVID. And in the same month, there was a baby girl born called Siva Corona. So it's definitely a double-edged sword. You may want to have some restrictions on what kind of names are allowed, or else you get, Virus Abdul COVID and Siva Corona. Now, some people are more creative even, and they'll go for something like Dinas Komunikasi Informatika Statistik, which literally means the Statistical Information Communication Office. Or better still, a man was named Tuhan by his parents. Tuhan meaning God. Tuhan is the generic word for God, whereas Allah is the Islamic word for God. So there are some very creative names in Indonesia. Now I want to say something about this change, the rise in this traditional names, whether it's Chinese or Javanese or Islamic names. I think this is a reflection of human nature. That is, we naturally gravitate towards people like ourselves. In a big enough group, people will carve out their own cliques, own identity groups. In Malaysia, we have big identity groups. And I'll say this just plainly, without judgment. Race is a big identity group, right? People bunch up by race, and even in places where race is not a big factor, like say in the United Kingdom, people bunch up by nationality: the English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, and even in a place as homogeneous as Japan, there are significant differences. people from Osaka, for instance, are, they're considered to be rather loud and fun-loving, great for good times. And then there are people from Kyoto who are considered two-faced. Never say what they truly mean. They're very indirect with their words. So what's happening in Indonesia seems to be just a natural trend of people flowing, towards the identities that they cluster around identities that make sense to them. And also, I feel like this is in following the theme of the previous video, my last video, where I talked about the change in mosque, what do you call, guidelines for the call to prayer. So there were some guidelines like lower the volume, make sure the audio is good and not discordant or like screechy, and then shorten the time from 15 minutes to 10 minutes. So I made the claim that this is reflective of a society that's more at ease with itself. So it's more relaxed now, and so the society starts caring about things that are around quality of life, right? Because forgiving and thinking that everything is in a good place where we like it, so we're happy to be more forgiving on some things. And similarly, I would say that this trend of more traditional names being permitted is another sign on that path, that is society being more relaxed and people doing what they like, picking up bits of identity that they identify with, they feel strongly about. I think it's a good direction for a society. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but my observation is that it seems like a good thing. And I think whatever with there is a very different historical path that Indonesia went compared to Malaysia. Malaysia never went through that time where there was like say some strong effort by the government to unify the national identity. Neither Singapore nor Malaysia had such an effort. Indonesia is unique in that respect. From my observation, I don't like it when I hear about mandatory restrictions by government to say, oh, your names have to be a certain way and you can't use these languages or perform this culture or use this culture out in public. I don't think that's good at all, because it's very restrictive and people should be free to do what they want. But Indonesia has, to my outside perspective, reaped some benefits from that. That is, perhaps people have more in common now. They have more in common because they were forced to have those things in common. And then after having those things in common, perhaps you have a society that is in those ways more cohesive. But you can only do it so far. You can push it only so far, because as you see, as these restrictions fall away, people naturally drift towards those clusters of identity that are natural to them as well. Again, so perhaps it was never going to be a thing that worked permanently. It can't be a thing that you just do and then sticks forever, right? Maybe that's just what it is. Okay, that's all the material. That's all the stuff I prepared for today. I'm gonna jump out of the browser screen so I can talk to you full screen. So let's see. Today we talked about China and the Ukraine war. Talked a little bit about 1MDB, as well as critical thinking around rhetoric and fake news, foreign influence. So though, if you like to read up on all these topics, as usual, check it out in the description. I'll post all the links there as usual. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed listening to me discuss all these topics, giving my a different perspective. I try to make it a point to take the topics of the day, cover the news, but think through them and then try to consolidate them in a way that gives you a different viewpoint on what's going on in the world. So yeah, if you like it, smash the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Thank you. Bye bye.